In tonight's episode, we have two stories to share. Two tales that linger in the dark corners of Asia, where silence is more unsettling than screams. The first takes us to South Korea, to a small town just beyond the reach of Seoul, where a family of 5 vanished without a trace. No warning, no goodbye, just gone. It was the winter of 1992 in Namyangju, a quiet stretch of land on the outskirts of the city. Snow had settled thick on the ground, muffling every sound, turning every road into a cold, white labyrinth. Inside one modest home, the lights were still burning, the television still flickered, and dinner still waited on the table, untouched. The door was locked from the inside, the windows sealed, and yet the family was nowhere to be found. When neighbors alerted authorities, investigators stepped into a scene that looked frozen in time, as if the residents had simply stood up in the middle of their meal and walked into thin air. But the most chilling detail wasn't the silence or the absence. It was what was drawn on the walls. Strange charcoal markings, circles cut with crosses, their purpose unknown. Some whispered it was shamanic protection, others the mark of occult. Whatever the truth, the family never returned. The Namyangju case begins not with the chaos of a crime scene, but with the quiet of an ordinary winter evening. The family at the center of this story lived in a modest 2-story house tucked at the edge of town. It was the kind of home that seemed almost swallowed by the surrounding fields and forest, where snow gathered against the walls and the night air carried the sharp smell of pine and smoke from far-off chimneys. Inside that house lived a family of 5. A father, a mother, 2 children, and the father's elderly mother. They were not wealthy, nor did they stand out in any unusual way. Neighbors described them as polite, reserved, people who kept to themselves. Yet something about that house would soon shift from ordinary to terrifying. In the weeks leading up to their disappearance, locals said the family had begun acting strangely. The father had stopped attending his regular job in Seoul, spending more and more time at home. The children, once seen playing outside after school, were no longer visible in the yard. And at night, the windows glowed longer than usual, shadows moving inside long after the town had gone to sleep. Some claimed they heard faint chanting on the cold wind, drifting from the direction of the house, though no one could say for sure. The setting itself only added to the unease. Namyangju in the early 90s was not the busy suburban extension of Seoul it is today. Back then, it was quieter, less developed, the kind of place where farmland stretched far between clusters of houses. At night, the streets emptied quickly, and the silence was so complete that even a creaking gate could carry through the stillness. It was, in every sense, the perfect place for something to vanish. The purpose of the evening, for the family at least, should have been simple. A meal, a warm room against the winter chill, perhaps a quiet night of television. They had set their table, prepared dinner, and switched on the set in the corner of the living room. All the familiar markers of routine were there. But when investigators entered days later, those routines were frozen in place, interrupted as if an invisible hand had pressed pause. Plates sat half-filled. Chairs were pulled back just enough to suggest someone had been sitting there moments before. The clock ticked on the wall, indifferent to what had happened. The atmosphere inside was oppressive, though no explanation could be given for why. Officers reported a strange heaviness in the air, as though the rooms themselves held their breath. And then, there were the walls. Black charcoal symbols scrawled across the plaster, uneven circles slashed through with crosses, repeated again and again like a desperate prayer or a warning. Some drawings looked rushed, others deliberate. Whoever had made them had spent time at it, marking multiple rooms as though no single barrier would be enough. By the time news spread through the neighborhood, fear had already set in. Some neighbors whispered that the family had joined a doomsday sect. Others believed they had tried a ritual for protection against something they feared was coming. The more religious residents muttered that no normal hand would have made such marks. Children were kept indoors, doors were locked earlier than usual, and when the wind howled across the snow at night, people looked toward the empty house and wondered if the missing family had truly gone somewhere, or if they were still there, unseen. And this is where the story lingers, suspended in that frozen moment of 1992. A locked house, a dinner uneaten, a family gone, and marks on the walls that no one could explain. A place where silence grows heavier the longer you listen, as though the walls themselves are waiting to speak. The first complication in the Namyangju disappearance revealed itself not in the dramatic sense of a crime scene discovery, but in the quiet unraveling of small, unsettling details that resisted explanation. It began when a neighbor noticed the house sitting in darkness one morning, long after the family would normally have stirred. The snow in front of their door remained unbroken, no footprints leading out, no sign of the children walking to school. At first, this seemed ordinary enough. Perhaps the family had gone on an unannounced trip. But as the days stretched on, the same picture presented itself. No lights beyond the television glow, no voices, no movements inside. The house seemed to hold its breath. The first real question surfaced when police finally forced their way in. The door was locked from the inside, a simple wooden bolt across it, the kind that couldn't be fastened once someone had left. The windows, too, were closed tightly, their locks unbroken, and yet the family was gone. The officers noted how everything appeared undisturbed, as if life had been interrupted mid-step. Chopsticks lay across bowls, rice hardened with time, soup had gone cold and congealed, still sitting in the center of the table. The television buzzed faintly in the background, its signal snowing into static. This would have been strange enough on its own. But then came the markings. The walls bore symbols that seemed childlike in execution but unsettling in intent. Circles drawn over and over in black charcoal, each slashed through with a rough cross. Some stretched high on the walls, others crouched low, near the floorboards. They appeared in the living room, the bedrooms, even the kitchen. The police at first thought they were the work of the children, doodles left behind in some fit of boredom. But the sheer number of them told another story. Someone had taken the time to carefully, deliberately cover their home in these marks, as though they had been bracing against something unseen. Neighbors were soon questioned, and their responses only deepened the mystery. One woman claimed she had seen faint flickers of light through the curtains late at night, shadows moving back and forth, long after the rest of the town slept. Another man swore he had heard murmurs, low voices drifting through the cold air, though he could never quite make out the words. Some said it was prayer, others insisted it was chanting. Still, others whispered that it sounded like sobbing. The first complication, then, was not simply the disappearance. It was the mounting realization that whatever had taken place inside that home had left behind not just absence, but presence. A lingering echo that the living could feel but not explain. Adding to the unease was the condition of the family's belongings. Coats still hung by the door. Shoes remained neatly arranged on the rack. Identification cards, wallets, and money were untouched. Even the bedding upstairs was turned down as though ready for sleep. It was as if the family had not left voluntarily but had been pulled out of their lives in an instant, without preparation, without escape. Investigators, baffled, began to consider possibilities. Had the family been abducted? If so, how could someone have entered without leaving any trace? No forced entry, no footprints in the snow, no broken locks. Had they staged their own disappearance? But then why leave food uneaten, possessions behind, lights and television on? And always, the question of the symbols loomed. One of the younger officers recognized them as resembling certain protective diagrams used in old shamanic traditions, though cruder, more desperate in style. In Korea's past, shamans often drew circles with intersecting lines to guard against spirits, to bind negative energy, or to trap something that should not be allowed to leave. If this family had truly been drawing such marks, the question became, what were they trying to keep out? Or worse, what were they trying to keep in? That possibility unsettled even the police. Some grew reluctant to linger in the house for long. One officer later admitted that while examining the upstairs rooms, he felt the hair on the back of his neck rise, as if unseen eyes followed him. Another swore he caught the faint smell of smoke, though there was no fire. Small, almost dismissible details, but ones that built a growing sense that something intangible lingered between the walls. Meanwhile, the townspeople grew restless. Rumors began to swirl that the family had become entangled with a secretive religious sect. South Korea in the early 90s had seen a wave of fringe cults promising salvation or warning of the world's end. It was whispered that the father had been seen speaking to strangers who never returned to the neighborhood, men in dark coats, women with veiled faces. Whether these stories were rooted in truth or born of fear, no one could say. But the timing was suspicious, and soon locals began avoiding the house altogether. Children were warned not to walk too close. Some crossed the street rather than pass its gate. What began as a strange disappearance was now becoming something darker, something layered in unease. A locked house that should have been empty, but didn't feel empty. Symbols that spoke of desperation. Neighbors' accounts of voices and flickering lights, and always the absence of any logical explanation. The first complication in this story was not simply that a family had vanished. It was that every detail left behind pointed away from human answers and towards something else. Something that couldn't be neatly categorized in a police report. Something that made investigators step carefully through doorways and neighbors whisper prayers when walking past. Something that hinted this disappearance was not the end of a story, but the beginning of a haunting that no one in Namyangju would forget. The days following the discovery of the empty Namyangju house only deepened the sense that something unnatural had taken place. The police investigation, instead of shedding light, seemed to pull everyone deeper into shadows. What should have been a simple case of a missing family was quickly unraveling into something that no one wanted to name aloud. The second strange event came only a week after the initial search. A local man walking his dog along the frozen river claimed he saw 5 figures standing near the banks in the pale light of dawn. They did not move, did not speak, but stood in a rigid line, facing the water. When the man called out, thinking they might be fishermen, the figures slowly turned toward him. But before his eyes could focus, the morning mist thickened, swallowing them whole. When it cleared, there was nothing there. He returned home shaken, convinced he had glimpsed the missing family, trapped between worlds. The police dismissed his story as imagination, but the townspeople took it as a sign. The family was not gone. They were still here, just not in a way anyone understood. Inside the house, investigators found something new that hadn't been noticed before. Tucked behind a loose panel in the master bedroom was a notebook. Its pages were filled with erratic handwriting, scribbles that sometimes dissolved into lines and shapes rather than words. In between the nonsense were fragments that chilled the officers who read them. They come at night. Voices in the walls. The circles are not enough. And one sentence, repeated over and over near the end. We must not leave together. The notebook offered no answers, only more questions. Who were they? Why were the circles not enough? And why was the family so certain that leaving together was forbidden? A conflicting character soon entered the picture in the form of a local shaman, an older woman whom villagers quietly respected but rarely mentioned to outsiders. When asked about the charcoal markings, she shook her head and refused to step foot inside the house. Instead, she warned the officers that such symbols were not drawn casually. They were meant to bind, to trap. She muttered that someone in that house must have been desperate, trying to keep something contained. When pressed, she would not elaborate, only saying that disturbing the balance could make matters worse. Her refusal to cooperate infuriated the lead investigator, who dismissed her words as superstition. But her warning lingered, fueling rumors and unsettling even the most skeptical officers. Meanwhile, the townspeople began to behave strangely around the investigators. Some urged them to close the house and leave it undisturbed. Others whispered warnings not to speak of it at night, as though naming the family after dark might summon them. A few claimed that since the police had entered the home, they themselves had experienced odd disturbances, doors rattling in the windless night, dogs howling at empty streets, and dreams where the missing family stood at the foot of their beds, silent and watching. The tension grew layer by layer, but no answers came. When the officers returned to the house for a second inspection, they found something unnerving. Some of the charcoal circles on the walls appeared darker, fresher than before, as if someone had redrawn them. And yet, the house remained sealed, no sign of entry since the first investigation. One officer laughed nervously, suggesting moisture or smoke stains had made them look new, but none of the others were convinced. The conflicting forces, skeptical police, fearful villagers, and cryptic warnings from the shaman clashed at every turn. Some argued the family had staged everything, slipping into hiding to avoid debts or enemies. Others whispered about possession, spirits, or cults. Every theory left gaps too wide to cross, and each time someone tried to piece the puzzle together, another strange clue appeared, pulling the story further from reason. By now, the house itself had become an unspoken character. People swore its windows reflected more than the snow outside. At night, passing motorists claimed to see faint silhouettes moving behind the curtains, though the electricity had been cut. The smell of burned wood occasionally drifted from the property, though nothing inside had been burned. And one evening, the officer who had first opened the locked door reported a dream so vivid he could not shake it. In it, he sat at the family's table, the bowl still warm, the television humming. Slowly, one by one, figures entered the room and sat across from him. Their faces were blurred, their mouths unmoving. But in his mind, he heard them whisper the same words written in the notebook. "We must not leave together." He woke drenched in sweat, his throat raw, as if he had been chanting in his sleep. The escalation had reached a point where the ordinary could no longer contain it. What had started as a missing persons case was unraveling into a labyrinth of strange sightings, cryptic writings, and chilling warnings. The family was gone, yes, but the traces they left behind seemed to multiply, spreading unease through the entire town. And still, there were no answers. Only silence, symbols, and shadows that seemed to thicken with each passing night. The turning point of the Namyangju case came during what should have been a routine follow-up inspection. By now, weeks had passed since the family had disappeared. The house remained sealed under police watch, though the community's unease continued to fester. Strange reports kept surfacing, neighbors hearing muffled voices, children claiming to see shadows in the windows, even stray dogs refusing to approach the gate. Still, the lead investigator insisted that all of this was hysteria. The family was missing, yes, but they would eventually be found. That was the official line. On a grey afternoon, a small team of officers returned to the property to catalogue evidence once more. The winter sky hung low, thick with clouds, and the air had that heavy stillness before a storm. As they unlocked the door and stepped inside, one officer immediately remarked on the smell. It was not rot or decay, but a sharp, acrid scent, like burned charcoal and damp earth. The others noticed it too, though none wanted to dwell on it. They spread through the rooms, documenting the strange symbols again, taking new photographs, flipping through the scattered pages of the notebook. Then came the sound, a soft, deliberate scraping, like chalk against plaster. It echoed faintly from the second floor. The team froze. Every officer knew the house had been locked tight, with no sign of intruders. Slowly, weapons drawn, they climbed the stairs. What they found at the top would haunt them. In the master bedroom, one wall bore a fresh symbol, still black, still smudged from the charcoal dust, as if it had just been drawn seconds earlier. No one had been in that room since the first inspection, and yet the circle and cross gleamed darkly, its edges sharp, its lines exact. One officer swore he saw the final stroke appear even as they entered, the cross marking itself as if by invisible hand. The silence that followed was suffocating. Before anyone could speak, another sound cut through the air, a rhythmic tapping from the far corner of the room. They turned toward the wardrobe, its wooden doors shut. The tapping grew louder, faster, almost like knuckles drumming. The lead investigator reached forward and yanked it open, empty, only coats and shoes inside. But the tapping continued, louder now, as though it came from within the walls themselves. The men backed away, the weight of the house pressing in on them. One officer, visibly shaken, whispered that they should leave immediately. Another, trying to steady himself, muttered that the family must have been involved in something occult, that they had unleashed something here. The lead investigator barked at them to stay focused, but even he was pale, his eyes darting toward the dark corners of the room. Downstairs, the television flickered to life. No one had touched it, and the power had long since been disconnected. Yet the screen glowed in the dim light, showing, not static this time, but a black frame broken by faint, pulsing white lines, almost like the symbols on the walls, drawn over and over again. One officer swore the lines shifted when they looked at them, forming words that dissolved before they could be read. Then, without warning, every door in the house slammed shut. The sound thundered through the rooms, shaking the walls, rattling the dishes on the abandoned table. The team panicked, rushing downstairs, but the front door refused to open. The bolt was jammed, as if nailed into place. Behind them, the charcoal markings seemed to darken, as though ink were bleeding through the walls. The notebook on the table flipped open by itself, its pages turning rapidly until it landed on the repeated phrase, "We must not leave together." And that was when they heard it, the voices. Not loud, not clear, but layered whispers filling every corner of the house. They came from the walls, the floorboards, even the air itself. Male voices, female voices, children's voices, all speaking at once, overlapping into a chaotic murmur. Some officers covered their ears, others shouted, but the voices only grew louder until one phrase seemed to cut through them all. "Stay with us." The lights flickered. The air grew impossibly cold, their breaths visible in front of their faces. And for a moment, each officer swore they saw figures in the room with them, blurred silhouettes standing at the edges of the walls, just beyond recognition. 5 of them. A father, a mother, 2 children, an older woman, watching silently, their faces hidden, their presence undeniable. The lead investigator, trembling, ordered everyone out. They forced the door until it cracked open, spilling them into the icy air outside. The moment they crossed the threshold, the whispers ceased. The television went dark, the tapping stopped, and the house stood silent once more, as though nothing had happened. That was the peak. The confrontation none of them had expected, the moment where the line between investigation and haunting blurred completely. The men left shaken, some refusing to ever return. And though the incident was never recorded officially in police files, those who were there carried it with them. Each wondered the same thing. What had they been standing inside of? A house where a family had vanished? Or a prison that still held them? Unseen, demanding company forever. The days after the officers fled, the Namyangju house were filled with silence. Officially, the report was bland, stripped of any detail that might sound absurd. The file noted the disappearance of 5 family members, the locked condition of the home, and the unusual wall markings. Nothing more. No mention of the television that turned on without power. No reference to the whispers, the tapping, the shifting figures in the corners of their vision. Those details lived only in the memories of the officers who had been inside, and none of them spoke freely about what they had seen. Not to colleagues. Not even to their families. But beneath the silence, the truth was taking shape. It was an older shaman, the same woman who had first refused to enter the house, who provided the clearest, if most unsettling, explanation. When one officer visited her privately, desperate for answers, she told him that the symbols on the walls were not protective charms, as many had assumed. Not exactly. They were bindings. Circles with crosses drawn through them were meant to trap something, to prevent it from escaping. In older Korean folk practices, such symbols were used not just to ward off spirits, but to imprison them within a space, to keep them tethered where they could do no harm to the outside world. The officer, chilled, asked her the obvious question. If the family had drawn these symbols to trap something, then what exactly had they been living with? The shaman's reply reframed everything. She said the family themselves might not have been trying to protect against something outside. They may have been trying to bind something inside. And if that was true, then the implication was terrifying. Whatever was trapped in that house was not an intruder, not an entity that came from the forest or the river. It was tied to the family itself. Perhaps one of them had carried it in. Perhaps one of them had become it. Suddenly, the fragments of the notebook took on a new weight. They come at night. The circles are not enough. We must not leave together. What if those words were not just paranoia? What if they were warnings? The family may have believed that if they left the house together, whatever haunted them would follow, unleashed into the world beyond. Their solution was desperate but simple. Stay locked inside, draw the symbols, bind it in place, until something went wrong. This revelation explained details that had baffled investigators. Why the food was left untouched, as if they had been interrupted. Why their belongings were undisturbed, as though they had never prepared to leave. Why the entire house had been covered in markings, not just the entrances, but the walls themselves. It wasn't random chaos, it was ritual containment. But if the family had succeeded, why were they gone? Here the shaman offered no answer, only a grim possibility. Binding rituals were never permanent. The force of whatever was trapped could wear them down, clawing its way free. If the family faltered even for a moment, the balance might collapse. Perhaps that was why the notebook repeated the phrase, "We must not leave together." Perhaps the family had tried to escape separately, one at a time, to prevent the presence from following. Or perhaps they had been taken all at once, erased in a way no one could explain. The chilling part was this: no bodies were ever found. Not in the surrounding woods, not along the frozen river, not in Seoul or beyond. It was as if the family had truly been consumed by the house itself, absorbed into the very walls they had marked. The officers who heard this explanation found themselves rethinking their own experience. The whispers they heard, layered and overlapping. The blurred silhouettes of 5 figures standing in the room with them. What if those had not been spirits in the traditional sense? What if they had been the family, caught in the trap they themselves had set, unable to leave the house even in death? It reframed the whole story in a darker way. The house was not just a place of disappearance, it was a prison, built and sealed by its own residents. And when the police entered, they had not merely disturbed a crime scene, they had stepped into a cage that was still occupied. The partial resolution was this: the family was not gone in the way people assumed. They had not fled, they had not been kidnapped, and they had not simply walked into the snow and vanished. They were still there, bound to the place they had tried to control. The symbols, the notebook, the voices, all of it told the same story. The family's disappearance was not an absence. It was a transformation. Yet even with this chilling frame, the full truth remained hidden. No one could say for certain what had been trapped in the house, or why the family had chosen to face it alone. No one could say what truly happened in those final hours when the food sat cooling on the table and the television flickered against the snow. But one thing was certain: Namyangju's vanished family had not simply disappeared. They had left behind a warning, scrawled on their walls and whispered through the years. The danger was not outside. It was inside. And perhaps it always had been. After the shaman's grim explanation, the Namyangju house was quietly abandoned. The police sealed it off, though no official closure was ever announced. The case remained open, technically unsolved, but no further searches were conducted. Over time, the snow melted, the seasons shifted, and yet the house stood untouched, its windows dark, its walls still bearing the strange black symbols. Locals avoided it with a quiet dread. Children dared each other to walk past its gate, but none lingered long. Some claimed the windows still glowed faintly at night, even with the electricity cut. Others swore that if you stopped on the road outside, you could hear faint scratching from inside, like charcoal against plaster, as though the symbols were still being drawn, over and over, by invisible hands. But the most unsettling detail came years later. A new family, strangers to the town, expressed interest in buying the property. Officials warned them of its history, but the buyers seemed unfazed. They paid in cash. Within weeks, the curtains were drawn, and once again smoke rose from the chimney. At first, it seemed like life had returned, but then the old whispers began again. Neighbors heard voices through the night. The lights flickered at impossible hours, and once more, no one ever saw the residents outside. One morning, the house stood dark again. The smoke stopped. The gate remained closed. When neighbors finally worked up the courage to check, they found the home exactly as before. Dinner on the table, chairs pushed back, belongings untouched. And on the walls, new symbols had appeared, drawn fresh, layered over the old ones. Circles with crosses, more frantic, more desperate. The police refused to reopen the case. The townspeople stopped speaking of it. And so the house in Namyangju remains, its windows blind, its rooms silent. Yet every so often, a traveler passing through swears they see 5 blurred figures watching from the glass. Were they the first family, the second, or both, bound together now in a place no one dares to enter again? The story of the Namyangju family was chilling enough, but it is far from the only time an entire household has been consumed by something darker than explanation. Across Asia, these vanishings and tragedies seem to echo each other, bound not just by crime or mystery, but by whispers of ritual, sects, and forces that never make it into police reports. From South Korea's vanished family, we now shift southward to the Philippines, where another family's fate became the center of both horror and conspiracy. What began as a brutal murder case soon twisted into something far stranger, with rumors of sacrifice, shadowy sects, and a legacy that still stains Cebu to this day. This is the other version of the Chiong family tragedy. The Chiong family tragedy did not begin in mystery. It began, like so many other stories, with the ordinary rhythm of life in Cebu during the late 90s. The Chiongs were not anonymous villagers tucked away in some remote countryside. They were well known in the city, respected, with ties that stretched into government offices and business circles. To most, they seemed like an ordinary middle-class family, raising children, working, trying to navigate the bustling life of Cebu City as the new millennium crept closer. But beneath that surface, whispers would later claim there were deeper ties, connections to underground sects, friendships with people who moved in spiritual shadows. At the heart of the story were 2 sisters, Marijoy and Jacqueline, Bright, young, and full of energy, they were seen often around the city, attending school, visiting malls, meeting friends. They weren't much different from other teenagers of the time, dressing to the trends, listening to music, eager for independence. Yet even their normal lives were colored by the growing unease in Cebu during that period. Crime rates were rising, abductions and gang violence filled the headlines. Parents warned their children not to walk alone at night. And there were darker undercurrents too, stories of abandoned quarries, of cult meetings whispered to be held in the shadows just outside the city. Cebu itself was a place of contrasts. At the center stood the bright malls, the colonial churches, and the constant noise of jeepneys and traffic. But step further out, and the city gave way to industrial ruins, overgrown lots, and stretches of lonely road where the streetlights barely worked. It was in this borderland between city and forgotten countryside that the tragedy would unfold, a place where ordinary life brushed against something far less human. On July nights in 1997, the Chiong sisters were simply expected home, like always. Their goal that day was nothing extraordinary: school, errands, the kind of routine every teenager takes for granted. They were supposed to walk through the door and settle back into the safety of their family home, but that door never opened again. Hours stretched into a night of worry, then into days of fear. When their bodies were later discovered near an abandoned quarry, the shock tore through Cebu like a wound. But here is where the context twists into something more unsettling. The official story of abduction, assault, and murder was horrific enough. Yet, from the moment their deaths were made public, alternative versions began to take root. Locals claimed that the sight of their bodies had long been associated with occult gatherings. Strange lights had been seen there at night, processions of cloaked figures moving silently along the quarry paths. Some swore that rituals involving animals, and sometimes even humans, had been performed in those spaces, out of sight of the authorities. And then came the questions about the family themselves. How much did the Chiongs know? How deeply were they tied into Cebu's shadowy spiritual circles? Some claimed the family's prominence was not just from wealth or connections, but from something older, more esoteric. That the daughters' deaths were not random acts of violence, but sacrifices. That someone, somewhere, had decided a price had to be paid. Whether these whispers were born from fear, from conspiracy, or from fragments of truth, they transformed the tragedy into something that could not be explained by law alone. The Chiong sisters were no longer just victims of a crime. They became figures in a story that blurred the line between legal case and ritual narrative, a story where a family was marked by forces that could not be seen. And so the stage was set. A city where everyday life existed side by side with shadowed gatherings. A family respected but rumored to be entangled in secrets. Two sisters, whose ordinary day became the doorway into one of the Philippines' darkest and most debated tragedies. The case would never rest, not because of the verdicts handed down in court, but because of the lingering belief that something larger, stranger, and far more sinister had claimed them. The first complication in the Chiong family tragedy did not come from the courtroom or the newspapers. It came from the whispers that began almost immediately after the bodies of Marijoy and Jacqueline were discovered near the abandoned quarry. The official version was simple, if brutal. Two young women abducted, assaulted, and murdered by men, later convicted in a trial that gripped Cebu. But for those who lived closer to the edges of that city, the ones who walked the quiet roads and heard the stories no paper dared to print, the details did not add up. Something darker lingered just beneath the surface. The first strange event was tied to the quarry itself. When investigators and townspeople first entered the area, they were struck not only by the horror of the scene but by the atmosphere of the place. The quarry had long been abandoned, its walls jagged, its ground uneven with years of erosion and neglect. Yet scattered across its stone surfaces were faint traces of burnt wax, melted in patterns that looked eerily like the remnants of candles. There were patches of ground that bore signs of repeated trampling, as if small groups had gathered there in circles. Locals, already wary of the quarry, began murmuring that it had been used for rituals long before the sisters' deaths. That night, no one wanted to remain there after dark. Even seasoned investigators admitted to feeling uneasy, the shadows of the quarry walls stretching too long, the silence broken only by the echo of their own movements. The obstacle came when the family themselves became the subject of suspicion. Normally, after such a tragedy, the community would rally in sympathy. But in Cebu, the Chiongs were not treated as only victims. Questions circulated almost immediately. Why this family? Why these daughters? Why here? Some pointed to the father, known to have powerful friends and connections. Others muttered about the mother, saying she had once attended gatherings of a spiritual sect that was whispered about, but rarely named. These weren't accusations of guilt in the crime itself, but of something more sinister, complicity, or at least proximity, to powers that demanded a price. And then came the first warning. A man from a neighboring barangay claimed he had seen something the night before the sisters went missing. He described a procession of figures moving quietly along a back road not far from the quarry. They carried no lights, yet he swore he saw the faint reflection of polished objects in their hands, metal or perhaps blades. Their footsteps made no sound. He thought it strange, but did not speak until after the tragedy, when the memory gnawed at him. When he finally shared what he had seen, others came forward, recalling flickering lights near the quarry on several nights leading up to the crime. Some described them as lanterns, others as fire that never produced smoke. This account was dismissed by the authorities, who focused on suspects they could name and charge. But for those who lived close to the quarry, the warning was clear. Something had been unfolding there long before the sisters arrived, something no one had dared to interrupt. The Chiong case was simply the first time it reached the headlines. The complication deepened when certain personal belongings of the sisters were never recovered. Jewelry, shoes, and even parts of their clothing were missing from the crime scene. The absence was attributed to theft, but among Cebu's more superstitious residents, it was taken as a sign of ritual. Objects belonging to the dead, they whispered, were often kept for ceremonies, to tie the spirit to a purpose or to appease whatever had been invoked. The quarry was not just a place of death, it was a stage. And the missing items were proof that the performance had not ended. For the Chiong family, this cloud of suspicion and unease became its own obstacle. Instead of being surrounded by sympathy, they were surrounded by rumors. Friends became distant. Neighbors lowered their voices. And at night, when mourners gathered at their home, some swore they heard faint chants drifting from the street outside, though no one could ever find who made them. The first complication, then, was not simply the crime itself, but the way the tragedy refused to remain within the boundaries of law. The strange marks of ritual at the quarry, the procession of silent figures, the belongings that vanished into the dark, and the whispers that the Chiongs themselves had ties to the unseen, these details pushed the case into a space where explanation faltered. And though the police dismissed these claims as superstition, the people of Cebu knew better. They had grown up in a place where shadows could carry stories, where quarries could echo with more than stone, and where tragedies often bore marks of something far older than crime. What had happened to the Chiong sisters was not just murder, it was a signal, a ripple that pointed to forces beyond human hands. The question that lingered after the first complication was simple, yet terrifying. Were the sisters chosen at random, or had they been marked long before that night? The tragedy of the Chiong sisters should have ended with the arrests, the trial, and the official story written neatly into the records of Cebu. But instead, The atmosphere around the family thickened, each passing month adding new layers of unease. The deeper one looked, the more the case resisted explanation, as though the surface truth had been deliberately placed to cover something much darker beneath. The second strange event emerged not long after the funerals. At night, mourners and neighbors reported seeing small groups of people gathering near the same quarry where the sisters' bodies were found. They weren't police, nor grieving relatives. These were shadowed figures, hooded or veiled, who stood in circles on the bare ground. From a distance, flickers of firelight could be seen. Some witnesses swore the figures carried long staffs marked with symbols. Others described hearing low chants carried on the wind. By the time anyone tried to approach, the gatherings dissolved, leaving only faint scorch marks in the dirt and melted wax embedded in the stone. For many, it was proof that the crime scene had not been abandoned at all. It had become a place of continuation, a ritual site still in use. Into this charged atmosphere entered a conflicting character. A local priest, outspoken and furious, who publicly denounced the rumors surrounding the Chiong family. He declared that the sisters were victims, not sacrifices, and accused the community of cruelly twisting grief into superstition. His sermons demanded silence on talk of rituals, warning that such gossip only distracted from justice. Yet his defiance only seemed to add fuel to the fire, because, even as he spoke, his church became the site of strange occurrences. Parishioners claimed candles blew out during Mass, shadows moved across the altar despite no one standing there, and once, during a prayer for the sisters, the doors slammed shut with such force that windows shattered. The priest insisted these were coincidences, accidents, tricks of the wind. But the congregation murmured otherwise, that he had angered something by denying it. Meanwhile, the Chiong family themselves began to receive warnings, subtle but chilling. Anonymous letters appeared at their home, written in messy script. Some carried a single phrase, "The debt is not paid." Others contained drawings of figures standing in a circle, their faces marked with crude X's. No one knew who delivered them, and police dismissed them as cruel harassment. But the family grew visibly shaken, withdrawing from public life. And those who lived nearby claimed they sometimes saw the parents pacing outside late at night, whispering to one another in tones too low to catch. A clue also surfaced, one that reframed earlier suspicions. A young woman who had once worked as a helper for the Chiongs came forward, hesitantly, to share what she had seen in their household months before the tragedy. She described late-night visitors, strangers who entered quietly, stayed for hours, and left carrying objects wrapped in cloth. She mentioned incense burning in the home at odd hours, and the sound of rhythmic knocking that sometimes lasted for minutes. She had never understood it, but in hindsight, she believed the family had been part of something far older and more secretive than anyone suspected. Still, nothing could be proven. Every new layer was fragile, built on whispers and impressions, and yet together they created a portrait of unease that was impossible to ignore. The second strange event at the quarry, the defiant priest whose church seemed haunted by the very denial he preached, the warnings delivered in cryptic notes, the testimony of a helper who had seen too much, all of these stacked into a growing sense that the Chiong case was not simply about two murdered sisters. Instead, it was about a family bound in shadows, caught between the official story that the courts demanded and the unofficial one that locals believed, that the girls' deaths were part of a ritual, a debt, or an offering to forces that had not yet released their grip. And through it all, the quarry remained silent during the day, yet alive at night, as if holding on to secrets too heavy to reveal. Those who drove past after dark swore they sometimes saw two figures standing near its edge, young women, their clothes torn, their faces blurred in the moonlight. They never moved, never spoke, but always seemed to be waiting for someone to recognize them, waiting for someone to finally ask what had really happened in Cebu in 1997. The escalation was complete. What should have been a closed case had become a wound that refused to heal, festering with visions, warnings, and whispers of forces too large to name. And still, the answers never came, only questions that grew darker with each passing night. The night of the peak confrontation in the Chiong tragedy did not come in a courtroom or in the pages of a newspaper. It came years later, in the quiet spaces where memory and fear had never loosened their grip. By then, the case had already been buried under verdicts and appeals, but in Cebu itself, the story still breathed. The quarry remained a place no one visited after dark, and the Chiong family lived under a shadow that time had not managed to dissolve. The moment arrived when a small group of locals, curious and reckless, decided to test the rumors for themselves. They had grown up with the whispers that the quarry was still active at night, that figures moved there when the city slept, that the sisters themselves sometimes returned. On a humid evening, they brought flashlights and ventured out. What they found made them flee in terror and later whisper their story only in fragments, never the full account. The first thing they noticed was the air. As soon as they reached the edge of the quarry, the atmosphere shifted. It was heavier, charged, as if every breath came with resistance. Their flashlights, brand new and fully charged, flickered. The beams stretched weak and thin against the darkness, failing to illuminate more than a few steps ahead. The silence was unnatural. No crickets, no rustle of grass, only the echo of their own movements. Then came the sound. Low, rhythmic, like the beating of a distant drum. At first they thought it was machinery from the city, but the quarry was too remote. The sound was inside the rock itself, pulsing through the ground beneath their feet. As they advanced, the rhythm changed, shifting into something that resembled chanting. Not loud, not clear, but layered, like dozens of voices murmuring beneath the surface. And then they saw them. Circles drawn into the dirt, blackened patches where fires had once burned. Some were fresh, the ashes still faintly warm. At the center of one circle lay a tattered piece of clothing. One of the men swore it was a school uniform blouse, stained and torn, though no one dared to touch it. Around it, half-burned candles still clung to the ground, wax pooled in uneven shapes. Before they could retreat, the chanting grew louder. And this time, it came not from beneath the ground but from the quarry walls themselves, as if the stone had learned to speak. The flashlights dimmed to nothing, plunging them into a darkness so complete it felt suffocating. One of them screamed when he saw figures emerging from the edge of the circle, blurry outlines of women, their hair matted, their faces hidden in shadow. They moved without sound, gliding, their shapes half-transparent, yet their presence undeniable. The group turned to run, but the path behind them was no longer empty. Hooded figures stood at the edge of the quarry, motionless, silent, blocking their way. Their outlines were faint, dissolving if stared at too long, but enough to send terror through the intruders. The chanting rose into a frenzy, the voices overlapping until the sound became unbearable. It was not a song. It was not prayer. It was command. In the chaos, one of the locals swore he heard a girl's voice cut through the noise, not chanting, not whispering, but pleading. "Help us." Just 2 words, sharp, desperate, unmistakable. But when he turned, the blurry figure of a young woman had already faded into the dark. The group finally broke free, stumbling toward the road, chased not by footsteps but by the sensation of dozens of eyes burning into their backs. When they reached the safety of the city lights, they realized their watches had stopped. Hours had passed, though it felt like only minutes. Their flashlights, though new, were completely drained. None of them ever returned to the quarry again. Word of their encounter spread in hushed tones. Some dismissed it as hysteria, young people scaring themselves. Others recognized the pattern. The quarry had always been a place of ritual. The figures, the chanting, the circles, they were not new. They were a continuation of something older, something that had never ended. For the Chiong family, the incident was another blow. Whispers reignited that the sisters' deaths had been more than random crime, that they had been marked, offered, or bound into a cycle that still demanded presence. For the wider community, it was confirmation that the case was not finished. It was not about suspects in courtrooms or verdicts on paper. It was about a wound that still bled, a ritual that still echoed. And for those who stood in the quarry that night, there was no more question of what was going on. Something lived there, tethered to that place, repeating itself again and again. The only question that remained was whether it was the sisters calling out for help, or whether it was something else, wearing their voices to lure others into the circle. The revelation in the Chiong tragedy did not come from the courts or the headlines. They had already offered their conclusion, neatly packaged with names, convictions, and sentences. But the people of Cebu whispered about another layer, one that revealed itself not in legal documents, but in the stories that clung to the family in the quarry long after the verdict. These revelations did not close the case, they reframed it. It began with an old story retold by elders in the surrounding barangays. Decades before the Chiong sisters were born, the quarry had already been feared. It was said to be a site of panata, vows and rituals carried out in secret by sects that believed blood was the only true offering to their gods. According to these accounts, livestock had once been brought there, bound and slain under the moonlight. But occasionally, when times were desperate, people were offered instead. The marks of those rites were said to linger in the land itself, a hunger that never died. When the sisters' bodies were found there in 1997, many quietly believed the quarry had simply claimed its due once again. Then came the discovery of documents, circulated privately among a handful of journalists and researchers who refused to let the case rest. These papers suggested that the Chiong family had connections to underground sects in Cebu, groups blending Catholic ritual with older, more esoteric practices. Meetings behind closed doors, exchanges of offerings, whispered oaths. There was no definitive proof, but the fragments aligned too closely with what neighbors had described: visitors at night, incense burning, rhythmic knocking that the family's household helper had recalled. If true, it reframed the tragedy. The sisters may not have been chosen at random, they may have been bound by their family's own associations. The strangest revelation came from a former quarry worker, now an old man, who spoke reluctantly to those still chasing the mystery. He described being hired to clear the quarry years before the tragedy, only to discover symbols carved into the stone itself. Circles intersected by crosses, triangles woven into spirals. He had thought little of it at the time, dismissing it as vandalism, but when shown photographs of ritual diagrams later, he froze. They were nearly identical. For him, the Chiong case was not about chance. It was about a site long prepared for a ritual that required blood. This explanation also reframed the small details that had always seemed out of place. The missing belongings of the sisters, jewelry, clothing, personal items, were not trophies taken by criminals but tokens, objects repurposed for ceremony. The processions seen on back roads, the flickering lights near the quarry, the scorch marks and melted wax discovered after the fact, all of it aligned with the idea that the tragedy was not a single moment of violence, but part of a longer, ongoing sequence. And then there were the warnings the family received, the notes declaring, "The debt is not paid." If the tragedy had been a random crime, why would such words appear? But if the family was enmeshed in rituals, even on the edges, then it made chilling sense. The deaths of the sisters may not have satisfied whatever sect or force they were tied to. The implication was clear. More might still be demanded. For those who believed this darker version, the revelation was devastating. It meant the sisters were not merely victims of violence, but unwilling participants in something much larger, marked by connections and vows they had never chosen. It meant their tragedy was not confined to a courtroom case, but part of a chain stretching backward and forward in time. And yet, even with this reframing, certainty remained elusive. Were the Chiongs truly connected to a sect, or were they scapegoats for a city's fear? Were the rituals real, or were they the inventions of a community desperate to explain a horror too large to accept? No one could say for sure. What was certain was that the case refused to rest. Each revelation pulled the story further from the neat borders of crime and punishment, and deeper into the realm of ritual and haunting. The quarry was no longer just a crime scene. It was a stage, marked and prepared long before the sisters arrived. The family was no longer only victims, but figures caught in a web of whispers, their name forever tied to forces unseen. The partial resolution was this: the tragedy was not random. It carried the weight of ritual, of vows, of debts unpaid. The murders were not the end of the story. They were the continuation of something older. And that realization reframed everything. The voices heard at the quarry, the figures glimpsed in the dark, the family's silence in the years that followed. It was not about justice anymore. It was about legacy, about a wound that Cebu could never close because it had never been meant to heal. In the years that followed, the Chiong tragedy never truly left Cebu. Officially, the case was finished, the guilty named, the verdicts written in stone. But outside the records, the quarry remained a place no one dared to linger. Drivers who passed it at night swore they saw flickers of fire or shadows moving in circles along the stone floor. Some claimed they heard girls crying softly in the distance, though when they stopped their engines, the sound vanished into silence. The family retreated further from public life, but the rumors clung to them like a second skin. The notes declaring, "The debt is not paid," stopped arriving, yet the fear they had planted never faded. Neighbors said that, even years later, the windows of the Chiong home sometimes glowed faintly at midnight, as though candles burned inside, though the family denied it. And then came the final twist. A construction company, years later, attempted to buy the quarry, planning to clear it for development. Surveyors arrived with equipment, but they never stayed long. They reported machines breaking down without reason, compasses spinning wildly, batteries draining in minutes. One man, shaken and pale, claimed he saw two girls standing at the edge of the pit, their faces blurred, their clothes torn. They were watching him, he said, not with anger, but with something worse, expectation. The project was abandoned before it began. Today, the quarry lies empty, its stone walls cracked, its ground littered with melted wax and scraps of cloth too weathered to place. No one patrols it, no one guards it, yet no one dares to enter after dark. And the story lingers, heavier with each retelling. Were the Chiong sisters victims of a brutal crime or unwilling sacrifices to something older? Was the family simply grieving or tied to debts no one outside could ever see? The answers remain buried in the quarry, waiting in silence. And if the debt was not paid, then perhaps it still isn't. I hope you enjoyed these stories. If you like them and want to listen to more, feel free to subscribe and put on your notifications. I upload almost every day. Wish you all the best.